Hi guys, welcome back to Matt Chat. This is episode number 19, in which we talk about one of my favorite arcade games of all time, Atari's Gauntlet. So what's so special about Gauntlet? Well, I can think of several reasons why this game's worth talking about. For one thing, like all the other games we've talked about in this series, it's still fun to play today. We had a good time playing this, putting it together for the Matt Chat. For another thing, though, is the design behind this game is very interesting and innovative, particularly when we think that it was developed for the arcade. Now, we don't play arcade games too much anymore nowadays, so I think we've come a long ways, gotten away from that dynamic, and this may not be so clear why Gauntlet was set up the way that it was. But it makes a lot of sense if you keep in mind the goal of an arcade game. It's very simple. They want people to come in and put in as many quarters into the machine as possible over as short a period of time as possible. So come in with rolls of quarters, dump them into the machines, run out of money fast, and you're gone. And a lot of the best arcade machines were pretty good at this, but of course there were some that once you got good enough, you could stay on that machine for hours. So keep that sort of issue in mind when we think about Gauntlet. Now, the gameplay of Gauntlet was obviously inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, the tabletop role-playing game. There are fantasy elements that are reminiscent of games like Ultima, just to name one. But there's also an arcade element. Obviously, a game like Ultima, which you play for hours and hours in front of your computer, is not going to adapt itself very well to something that needs to be in an arcade and sucking down quarters. So what the developers did, and I should mention there is some controversy over who actually developed this game. As we'll see, there was an earlier game called Dandy that came out for the Atari 8-bit a few years before Gauntlet. And to me, it's very obvious that Gauntlet was, I don't want to say it's a ripoff of Dandy, but it was a very close imitator. It borrowed a lot of the ideas. The short of it is there doesn't seem to be a clear credit for who created Gauntlet. Most people seem to think it was Ed Logg, who did some earlier hits for Atari, including Asteroids. But anyway, what's brilliant about Gauntlet's design is, they were able to successfully adapt a very arcade-style gameplay along with fantasy elements and things that are familiar to anyone who's played role-playing games. But perhaps even more so than that were two other things. One is that 4 people could play this game simultaneously. The arcade cabinets actually had 4 different joysticks and button stations so that you and 3 of your buddies could all gather around this machine and play it all at once. So one machine sucking down 4 players' quarters. So that was a good design decision. But even more so than that was the health timer. Basically, each character or each player's health is ticking down with a clock. And it doesn't matter if the player is being attacked or just standing around, that health is still ticking down. And there's ways to replenish this. You can find food in the game to give yourself more health. But more likely is that as this health approaches 0 and you're about to die, you get this sort of ominous message, something like, "A warrior is about to die." Say, oh, that's pretty bad. But guess what? If you put another quarter in, you get more health, and warrior stays around. So this was great. So suddenly it didn't matter if the same group of guys stayed in front of this machine and they could stay on it for hours and hours, because periodically they're going to have to put in more quarters to continue play. So it's a brilliant decision. And unfortunately, though, this did mean that if you showed up to the arcade and wanted to play Gauntlet and there were already people on it, you might be waiting for a very long time to get to play. But that probably didn't matter so much to arcade owners. They're just happy to have a machine generating so much revenue. So fantasy RPG adapted into an arcade action game. I think it's worth a look. Before we go much further, I wanted to say a quick word about the best way to play this game. Obviously, it was ported to a wide variety of systems, including many computers and consoles. You can look at that. But in any case, I would suggest that you try to, maybe look into something like the X Arcade, which you can see here. My wife and I playing a dual X Arcade, and this device like this runs about $100, and it will give you a much closer approximation of the original arcade style gameplay with the joysticks and the buttons. I really like mine. I just thought I'd mention that in case you haven't heard of that. Now, before we get started with Gauntlet, I'll say a quick word about myself. My name is Matt Barton. I am the author of Dungeons and Desktops, a book about computer role-playing games, and co-author of Vintage Games, a book that looks at a broad spectrum of games from all platforms and eras that were influential. If you like this video, I'll check out those books, comment this video, rate it, drop me a line. I really love it when you guys write me. I love reading your stuff. I really appreciate that you're watching and commenting and enjoying these. All right then, without further ado, let's play Gauntlet. What we'll start off here with is the arcade game's attract mode. Now, an attract mode is something an arcade game uses to attract people over to put in a quarter, but also it's very common to do what we see here. The attract mode is being used to teach people about the game, give them some tips, show them the rules. But there's really not a lot that you need to know in order to play this game. You are shooting these various types of monsters. You're shooting the generators where they spawn. Certain types of monsters you can run into and fight melee style. Others must be fought from a distance or they'll do damage to you. But the strategies open up when you bring in your friends to play. Then you can do lots of neat things. Basically, if you have good friends that know the game well, you can use them to help you lure monsters into certain areas, keep them away from the party, and so on. There's also certain items and power-ups you can find. Food will restore health, and then you can do things like speed up your character, speed up your shots. So those, I guess, are about roughly the equivalent of leveling up in a role-playing game. There are also different types of monsters and different levels. You see here they start off very easy to kill, and then the ones that are more brightly lit take more shots to kill and do more damage. You have demons. So these monsters are all very familiar to anyone who has played Dungeons and Dragons. Now, like any good game of D&D, not everybody plays the same type of character. There are, in fact, 4 different classes, if you will, to choose from. There's Thor the Warrior, who has a good melee attack, good hand-to-hand combat. There's a wizard named Merlin, who has special abilities when it comes to the potions. There's Thyra the Valkyrie, who has good armor, and then Questor the Elf, who seems to be the best all-around character. But basically what we're going to see here is lots and lots of monsters to kill. Gauntlet really throws a bunch of stuff at you. There's no possible way you can avoid all of it, so it's really a matter of mitigation, trying to kill as many enemies as you can before they get to you, trying to destroy these generators before they have the chance to pop out more monsters. And then food. You can play greedily, eating all the food yourself, or if you notice that your friend is low on health, you might let her have the food instead. So there's lots of quick snap decisions that have to be made. That said, I don't wish to exaggerate the role-playing and adventure game elements here. This is primarily a fairly straightforward arcade action shooter style game, with just a few role-playing and adventure game elements grafted on. Now here I have 3 of the ports of this game side by side for a fun little comparison. You might try to guess, see if you can figure out which platform is which, but the one on the left is the Commodore 64, the one in the middle is the Nintendo, and the one over on the right is the Atari ST. And as you can see, each of these was a little bit different. The Nintendo one is probably the most different. And here is Gauntlet 2 arcade version, which made some improvements. And here is the much later Dreamcast version of Gauntlet Legends, which was another popular hit in the franchise. And that's all for this week's Matt Chat, but remember, don't shoot your food.